best way to think about proposal writing in terms of artistic practice is, again, in terms of like inspiring someone. My name is Jamie Allen, and I'm an artist and researcher, and I do lots of work at the cusp of kind of infrastructure, media, and ecology. So I'm interested in these kinds of themes. That often takes the form of media projects like films and media performances and online work and stuff like that. I mean, my main interest in things like proposals has to do with a general interest in the way that people are not always that aware of what it is that they actually do versus what they think they do. So as artists who, often, project this idea of being a creative practitioner, we think of ourselves as people that sit in studios and do creative work, whereas actually we do a lot of other things. We do emailing and administration and budgeting, and our practices are much more broad. And I've always been interested in trying to turn those practices into part of what we think of as creative practices, so that we do more of what we think we do, or that we are more enabled and more free and more open in the rest of our lives as we are in, again, quote unquote, creative practices. No, I mean, what I'm inspired by is the human effort behind it. Like the amount of people who are writing reports for like Helvetia or, all these different contexts where it's like, you're just amazed at the amount of it, like the amount of PDFs that are just sitting on some server on a government website that somebody who typed them into a keyboard. That to me is in the grand sense is a larger creative oeuvre than any single poet, or because they're all writing in a particular similar style, and you could use that as the background of a creative practice for sure. I mean, it's a crazy archive of stuff, but it's also just something that says, like, if you think of it that way, it's almost like we've won the battle of life and art merging. Like if you can see the world a little bit more that way, where the floor that you're sitting on was actually made by somebody, the building you're working in, has been creatively designed in some way, that somebody did all that care and love to make it that way. And then you think about like institutions the same way and proposal writing the same way. I think you're just a much more inspiring person than than you would otherwise be. I mean, I think we should start with the idea of like what practical means, because changing your brain and changing your mind and changing your approach to something is very practical. We know this from, everything from psychoanalysis to meditation. What you're trying to do is essentially perform a little bit of like mental jujitsu on the idea of proposal writing. So it's something that you have to do, and that is the main reason that most people don't enjoy that process, I think. The idea that it could become something that liberates your future, for example, is what got me to the notion that in some senses it's a sort of science fiction of the self, right? So it's this future that you're imagining, that you're involved in, and so and often involves like sort of technical and sociological structures that you're imagining exist in the future. And so in that sense, it's a sort of fiction. Creative practitioners being sort of good at fictions and good at imagining things, putting it in that category, I think just immediately makes it kind of practically different. Instead of approaching it as something that needs to justify, explain, document, if you see what I mean. So it's about pushing something into the future instead of turning something from the past or from the present into a kind of almost litigious document that proves why someone should give you money, right? And so practically it's about a brain shift. It's about a kind of a change of approach that allows you to be more free in those moments where you're starting to think through, like, how am I going to talk to these people about this thing that I want to do? If you think about all those little constraints as things that could be, I don't know, like a game, or a crossword puzzle, or these sorts of things that are quite liberating, I think, in terms of starting that process. Instead of coming to it like a set of rules that you have to then, shape yourself into, coming to it as something that like is a creative challenge. If I'm totally honest, not always. Of course. I mean, there are certain communities and certain worlds where, you're sort of expected to, I think, sort of manifest your discipline. And I mean that, discipline is a good word, right? Because it means both like academic discipline and discipline of following the rules. And I've definitely been there. Overly cynical, overly dumbing down, overly projecting what somebody wants to the point that it loses all its magic. It loses all of its kind of fiction. It loses all of its kind of potential for the future, which has a long story. I mean, there's a big reason why all that's happening and why things become more and more formatted. I even think about things like Mark Fisher's idea of capitalist realism when you ask me that question, right? Which is this idea that we can't imagine anything but the current system. And if there's no force within us to create like something that pushes those systems to be a little bit more, open again and creative, then where's that force coming from? So it's a bit of a responsibility to maintain that creativity inside these kind of rubrics and like bureaucracies. Just acknowledging that there are influences and references and things that you're inspired by doesn't mean you're not being original. It means that you are acknowledging the fact that you live in the world and have a history and a biography. So it's just human, right? So there's no contradiction there in my mind. There's contradictions in the demand for that, which I think is something that we need to change in creative cultures, artistic cultures, and design cultures, right? Like the idea that I'm, respecting something by calling it into play when I'm proposing something that I want to do should be a matter of gratitude and appreciation. It shouldn't be a matter of justification and who agrees with me and these kinds of framings. There's a long discussion about referencing, for example, in academic work, where obviously who you reference matters, like what you're calling into play when you say, Heidegger said this, it's like some white Nazi, right? Like you're bringing that person into the brain of the person reading that thing, which is different than bringing in, maybe the same point by a scholar who's younger, non-white and not part of the canon of, a long history of particular kinds of thought. And in doing that, what you're doing is effectively a kind of mode of appreciation or a mode of like representational practice. It can also be a way of thinking about how you've collaborated with people you've never met, or things from the past, and somehow in a strange, metaphysical way, you're sort of collaborating with, the history of creative practice. If we think about proposals as a creative practice, i.e. a science fiction of the self, then pretty much everything changes. Your relationship to things like references and the history and the justification and all this sort of stuff changes because it becomes more like the context for the story. When you think about your own role in something and trying to get someone to give you support for that new activity or thing that you're proposing, it can be more like the protagonist of the story and somebody who has lots of actual freedom within that whole story and can improvise their way through the score that's set out by the whole story. And even the resources that you're asking for can start to feel like constraints that are driving the story forward, And so it's a bit like an overall reconfiguration to think about the proposal as a science fiction in that way. I think the most beautiful way to approach that has to do with your relationship to the world being translated through that kind of document, right? I mean, it is a document, and so we have to think about our relationship to writing and words and diagrams and things like that, and how much of that we can kind of understand as part of a creative material, right? Because I think, unfortunately, when we put it into the really utilitarian sense of what a proposal's for, they're not going to be very good, and so you're not going to be successful, and you're going to waste your time. I think what's wonderful is it's an opportunity to bring your internal world out into an external world when that's possible. It's not always possible. So the approach would be, to remember that you can't just talk about yourself, and you can't just talk about the thing that you want to do. There's some kind of a transmutation going on through this document. It's almost alchemical in its ability to sort of allow you to have an opportunity to talk about this vision you have, this creative project that you want to do, this relationship that you want to have to both your own materials, and an audience, I guess. And then also acknowledging that there's a world out there that has to fit into. There's a process ongoing, contemporary art or design discourse or the research world or whatever it is that you are interested in and you want to be part of, right? And so yeah, that's, I think the high level advice for proposal writing is it has something to do with like being aware of your internal world and describing it, using the document to translate that out into multiple or at least one external world. And unfortunately, I think sometimes people do a little bit too much of one or the other, right? You end up talking about your practice a lot without acknowledging that there's some place it has to go, or you end up talking about a world you wish you could exist in without describing what it is you're going to do. It's one of these things where it's about assumptions about what it is you're supposed to be doing in a proposal that trips people up, where it actually could be the description of your inability to describe the process, actually, right? Or your inability to, in advance, describe that process could be the proposal. And so I think we just need to be more, again, like creative about how you're actually approaching that situation. The best way to think about proposal writing in terms of artistic practice is, again, in terms of like inspiring someone, I think. In part, that's you. Like it's in part it's trying to get yourself inspired to do something. Again, it's just a reframing exercise in your brain to think about this not as like, oh, I just want money to do my art. It's I want to engage with this particular institution. I want to talk to these people in this particular way. I want to understand this about my process. I want to become better in this way in what I'm doing. And then that liberates the way that you can talk about it, because then the thing you're proposing is that, it's not a kind of cynical or like, a little bit simplified version of I need these materials to do this thing, which is not really going to inspire anyone reading it. I mean, this is why being careful is good. And I mean that in every way, like careful, i.e. full of care for the thing that you're applying to, actually, the thing that you are doing, yourself, your time, your sort of effort and your own attentions. And if you care for all of that, and you come to a proposal writing moment or a proposal preparation moment where you think like, these people are not gonna resonate with what I'm doing, and this is a context that I'm having to do a lot of work in order to imagine my proposed fiction in that future that has not come yet, then maybe it's not the right thing for you to be spending time on, right? There's a moment when you realize that it's so difficult to make that match that maybe that isn't something you should be doing. That said, the more you know about that context, the more you really think about whether or not this is the right thing for the thing that you're trying to do, the better you're going to be able to do this matchup between your internal life world and imaginative world and the world that they're occupying. So I think it's important to be aware of all that stuff for sure. And again, I think sometimes the problem with certain kinds of practices of, creative practices is that they're telling people that over and over again that they have to be individualized and the originator of all ideas and entirely novel and all these kinds of pressures, which is not a very generous relationship to the world, right? And so if that's what you're trying to be and want to be, then maybe the kind of work you're doing doesn't really need to interact with other people, and therefore why you're writing a proposal. This is kind of weird irony and all that. And so I feel like the proposal process, if you can't always, always repeat that. If you can make it into something that feels like that translation of your internal world into an outer world and vice versa, then it can become part of your creative practice and doesn't feel as forced. There are projects, for example, that I do, for example, which are not involved in the proposal writing process. You just do them, right? This is a different kind of practice, which is everything from, painting in your basement to writing poetry for a friend, not everything has to fit into this format is all I mean. Like you can write proposals for particular kinds of projects when that feeling and that research you've done on that context feels right, but you shouldn't always actually. I think what we have gotten into is a culture and a situation which I don't always love, which has to do with the idea that you're not allowed to do anything until you get the money or until you get the proposal through, right? Until the project has been authorized by someone else, you're not supposed to do it. And that's not a good situation. There are certain things that require collaboration, resources, and institutions to be involved, where a proposal makes sense, and building up this kind of storyline and then getting some kind of support for that kind of project makes sense. But it shouldn't be the only thing you do, and it certainly shouldn't be the thing that authorizes or does not authorize creative practice, which is something you should do in as many categories of life as possible. It has definitely affected me a lot in the past, and I think I've learned a bit to not let it. It always reminds me of an interview that I read once with John Lennon, who was being asked about his relationship to music critics. And he, I think, had just put out an album that wasn't very good, or like at least the critics didn't like it very much. And what he said was, it's so amazing that somebody can tell you something about a very specific individual piece of practice, and it seems to devaluate, and devalue everything that you've done for 20 years. Like the last thing you did is always the thing that you sort of feel is the most important. I think that's something, again, culturally in creative practices we need to get out of. You and I have a long period with which to do the wonderful creative work that we want to do, and it might have different manifestations and it might have different styles. But I try to look at that kind of long game as much as possible when you think about like an individual proposal being rejected, but I have all these other things that I'm looking forward to, I have all these other things that I'm doing, I have all these other things that I have done, and those individual things are not, they're part of a life, they're not part of a success or failure in that particular moment, they're just a learning process and an opening into the next thing. There's a very practical piece of advice which I had once given to me, which is always have another proposal out there, so that whatever you don't get, you can always feel like, oh, there's still this other thing that I'm waiting for. And so it's a kind of game like this. That's a bit silly, but yeah. That to me reminds me of this idea that ideas don't come from people, they sort of happen to people, I find. There's a kind of moment and a constellation of where something really incisive 2 years later doesn't feel that incisive, or massive changes in the world, which seem to happen fairly regularly nowadays. They make you feel like that's not a relevant thing to look at. And that just proves the point that that idea was never yours anyway, in the sense of it being something you really wanted to do. It was something that the world suggested, you thought of, and there was some history and there was a biography that you had that made that interesting in that moment. And if it goes away, that just proves it wasn't yours, you know what I mean? It might come back again. Don't throw it away completely, put it on a post-it note somewhere, or do something, put it on a document and remember that you thought about it for a minute. But otherwise, don't get too attached to this thing being my one technique or my one thing that will matter for all time. I think that's always a bad idea. A mistake is to not look at the context to which something is being proposed enough, to not know a little bit about what they care about, what the values are, who the people are behind something, and then attempt a little bit to embody that, or at least again translate what you are feeling, wanting, and seeing into that world a little bit. I think people tend to be a little bit resistant to that. On the other side, I think people sometimes don't explain their own positionality enough. So where am I coming from? Why am I doing this? What's important about it? Why are you going to help me make this happen? I think is something that I guess it's difficult because of people's insecurities and things sometimes to really say why you want to do something, but that's really important as well. So it's a mistake not to do that. It's a mistake to assume that somebody understands your history, context, and biography, just as it's a mistake to assume that all institutions are the same and don't have their own histories and biographies and care and values. The other thing is, I guess, assuming that there's something in the style of writing, like so in a kind of smaller framing of that same kind of problem, assuming that you're supposed to do it a particular way without really knowing how you're supposed to do it. There's a lot of what they call straw men, like, a lot of things that we think to be true that are not true, that are just carried through like rumor and reputation and stuff like that, where the writing should be really boring, or that you have to do a budget this way, or that these are not often true, actually. And there's a lot of formatting and kind of formats that people are using out there that are just kind of old and don't make any sense for the kind of practice they're doing. So there's a kind of practical mistake being made there. I think people sit down and do it sometimes and just bore themselves to death before they start writing it, and then you're like, well, I can tell. Why would I want to help you do that? I don't know why I would. I mean, it's important to make sure that you format it correctly and you don't have like spelling mistakes and stuff like that. That's probably true, because it gives people a sense of how much you care about what you're doing. Also, things like degrees of clarity, like the idea that like sections can be very helpful, for example, for like just ensuring that you are really talking about that one thing in that section, and then you can always remove the section headings or whatever. But something about the way that people write tends to be very like people talk, which is kind of peripatetic and a bit all over the place. And so it's good to remember it as a form. Like it is, there are writing styles and writing practices that will help you make sure that what you're doing is like clear to somebody else, and these things can be mistakes. A portfolio is kind of a proposal because you are sort of proposing to do more of that, but it's different. Like I think there's something actually quite more open about that process. Like you're not being asked to project as much as you would be doing in like a project proposal, research proposal, this sort of stuff. You can do things like have a friend help you with that process. For example, like reporting on yourself is very difficult. This has been the case for for everything from biographies to ethnography to anthropology to all this. Why we have all these sciences is because we're not very good at like explaining what we do if we're the ones who did it. And so that's one strategy, maybe having somebody else involved, having them interview you, having them bring out something of the work that you wouldn't necessarily even see. And then maybe you can pretend to be that person. That's another slightly weirder technique, is to like come to the work and be like, and pretend it wasn't you that made it, and try to make that kind of come out in the process of reporting on it, which is kind of what you're doing, like when you document something, it's telling the story of a project. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really different topic though than because why I love this world of research and art and stuff like that, maybe a bit more than the classical studio art practice, is because you can do that future telling. You can, like, the next project might have new collaborators, a slightly new topic, although you tend to have the things you're interested in, a new kind of creative output, a new, and all of that is based on fundamentally what's a good idea right now, some of the things you've done in the past, but really it's about projecting, and I think that's maybe sometimes less true in the art world, in the classical art world. You're actually expected to do something very similar to what you did before. Yeah. We're currently doing a lot of work, for example, collaboratively, looking at just all the different ways that, like, an artistic or a research project or an artistic research project can find publics. You can publish things, you can do exhibitions, you can do workshops, you can do panel talks, you can get involved in a festival, but you can also start a company, protest, go have a meal with someone. You know what I mean? All that stuff is, like, to me, the world of extradisciplinary practice, sometimes we call it, or like modes of manifesting a creative or artistic project, which I don't know how to put those into a portfolio. I'm not sure. I don't know if there's a way. I think it matters what we mean by transparency. Like I think there's a lot of listings of people and, you know, like criteria and a lot of technical systemic kind of transparency, which is what normally people mean by transparent. And so I don't know if creating more of that is always solving the problem of people just feeling left out of a process, if you know what I mean. I think some of it comes from efficiency, like, you know, when you get 400 applications, it's difficult to make a process like that transparent, because how do you deal with that? I'm not, you know, I'm not sure there's a way to solve it. Certain things just don't feel right, and you have to kind of be like, okay with that. I think in the end, what we should end up with is much more communal, you know, like if we really want the kinds of institutions that we feel part of, they feel like they're supporting us no matter what, even if, you know, we're kind of, I don't know, going through a bad period, or, you know, this is the world that we want, is something that, like, where we feel that we are institutions and institutions are us, and we're kind of able to sort of have a dialogue that says, this is what's needed in this moment, and we can all kind of make it happen. I think that's a much more positive form of transparency. Is feeling included, feeling safe, feeling able to do stuff. I don't think most art institutions are like that. I think that would, I don't think anybody thinks that. Meaning most art institutions are fairly opaque, a little mysterious, kind of tough on people, and difficult places to work. And so this is a problem. I don't know. Yeah, you either don't work with them, try to transform them, or go do something else. You know, meaning something beautiful and good and creative and with your friends. You know, that's all I mean. Not like you can't be an artist. I just mean you don't necessarily have to deal with that in transparency, that opacity. But no, I definitely don't think art institutions in general operate in a way that's, shall we say, like healthy and collaborative with the art communities in which they're embedded. I think that would be fairly obvious. Yeah. I do think, you know, that collaborative and collectivized practices are always what problematize and push against the way that, like, an art institution wants an individual creator to, like, produce something for it, and therefore, you know, gives them money for this and that reason. I think, you know, I've been very inspired by the last couple of years of, like, collectives coming in to direct biennials and, you know, be involved in festivals in ways that aren't just being invited to do a project, but, like, you know, that collectives are able to, like, direct things. It's kind of a new idea. And I think similarly, like, being a collective that's applying to something is strangely destabilizing for that whole system, you know, because what it does is it sort of, you know, that system isn't sure who is awarding it to or who the authorship is coming from and all this sort of stuff, which then almost requires it to be more transparent in some sense, because it starts to then ask questions about itself and how it's structured vis-a-vis being able to allow that to happen. So this kind of amorphous structure and stuff like that, I think is a really positive general strategy, shall we say, to, like, do both, you know, work that doesn't worry so much about specificity of, like, where ideas come from, which I'm interested in, work that is both an institutional critique and an operational strategic mode, so, like, it changes the situation at the same time as it's doing something. And then, yeah, it's just fundamentally like socially creative. Like, it's more collaborative and open, and is going to produce things that wouldn't come from a single person. Right. Well, I think coming across the idea of something like grey literature, you know, there's this discourse about that. There's a great book called Evil Media, which is sort of referring to this idea that, you know, a lot of very nefarious things happen in the world of boring forms and administrative documents and stuff like that. And just knowing that that is there, I think, was inspiring to me as a discourse and as a place to go and think about, like, wow, look at all this material that's being generated and what is it doing to the world, you know? And so there's a performative sense of, like, of all these documents, you know, creating worlds in some sense. And so knowing about that was really important to me. I think people like Mark Fisher's work is very important, like thinking about the relationship between administration, creativity, scholarship, being a thinker and an intellectual in the current age, vis-a-vis labor, actually, and how much you're getting paid for these things and creative labor. And another one is relationships to things like creative labor and cultures of like digital and online creativity and this sort of stuff. David Graeber, who recently passed away, unfortunately, he wrote a great book called Bullshit Jobs, which is really about the way that like there's so much sort of background stuff going on that doesn't really need to be happening. And partly I think I got the inspiration of this idea that like, that if we made things more inspiring, they would be creating more inspiring worlds and more inspiring realities, right? But unfortunately, a lot of the things that we've been sort of doing in work life and in administrative life, it's deadening, and it makes people both bored and boring. And so this is the thing that I think is worth fighting. There's a neoliberal regime out there that made proposal writing part of our lives, which is not necessarily positive. And by absorbing that into your creative practice, you're also kind of going along with it in a way that can be a little dangerous. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's not necessary. Like, I'm not sure what else to do because I want to do this kind of work, right? So personally, I like collaborations. I like working in institutions. I like research practice. I like, having time to look at ideas over a longer period than just like the 2 weeks that I have to do it when I'm not doing something else. And so those processes, require me to do this thing. And so I've done this, or trying to do this argumentation for myself that says that this should be part of my entire oeuvre practice, creative work. But there are people out there who would find that entire lack of resistance to the proposal, shall we say, part of a grand project of Americanized neoliberal, unromanticism, shall we say. Yeah. And I'm not sure how I feel about that sometimes. Like, that's also true. That's a really good point. Like, so if you get hit with the critique that like all proposing is neoliberal and therefore we should be resisting these kinds of bureaucratic processes in our creative practice, there's a higher level at which, like I said about proposal as marriage, or proposal as, which is it's literally called a marriage proposal. It's the main way in which we try to collaborate with each other, right? Like we say, hey, would you like to go get a sandwich? And people go, yeah, I'd like to go get a sandwich. I mean, that level of like philosophical inspiration, or the way in which that process brings new ideas into play, is beautiful, and I just can't imagine a world in which we don't, in some sense, propose to each other. It's hope. I mean, it's fundamentally hope, right? Like it's about a world you want to see.